Good afternoon and welcome to our abnormal psychology. We have just begun Unit 3, that is mental mechanism. Unit 3, mental mechanism or defense mechanism. Mental or defense mechanism. Mental or defense mechanism. So we have seen this mental or defense mechanisms are the strategies or techniques used by our ego to protect our mind from frustration, from unpleasant happening, from unpleasant thoughts, feelings and emotions and sentiments. And we have also seen the background to understand this defense mechanism from the Freudian perspective. Sigmund Freud, he speaks about 3 levels of mental life and then 3 provinces of the mind. What are the 3 levels of mental life? That is conscious mind, pre-conscious mind and subconscious mind. Basically divides into 2, conscious mind and unconscious mind. The unconscious mind is further subdivided into pre-conscious mind and subconscious mind. So pre-conscious and subconscious together forms the unconscious mind. And he says what we know is only the tip of the iceberg. The vast majority of the human personality is like the iceberg that is submerged in the ocean. So what we know is only the tip of the iceberg. And he also speaks about 3 provinces of the mind which are connected to these 3 levels of mental life, that are id, superego and ego. Id works on the pleasure principle, always wants to satisfy itself, whereas superego is the moral agent. It works on the moral principle. It's like our conscience, it works on the moral principle, whereas ego is in the middle of these 2. It works on the reality principle. It has to satisfy the pleasure seeking, the mentality of the id, as well as the moral principles of the superego. So ego is in the middle too, as it works on the reality principle. So basically these defense mechanisms are the mental mechanisms, are the strategies or techniques used by our ego to protect our mind from the anxiety, from tensions, from worries, from unpleasant thoughts, unpleasant sentiments and unpleasant feelings. Now we shall see some more explanation or the definition for these mental mechanisms or defense mechanisms. So these defense mechanisms are the mechanisms or manners in which we behave or think in certain ways to protect or defend ourselves. So these are the mechanisms or manners. Mechanisms or manners. So mental defense mechanisms are the mechanisms or manners in which we behave or think, in which we behave or think. We behave or think in certain ways to protect or defend ourselves, to think in certain ways. Certain ways to protect or to defend ourselves, to better protect or defend ourselves, to better protect or defend ourselves, or defend ourselves. So the basic idea is protect and to defend. That is the key idea. So these are the mental mechanisms or defense mechanisms, are the mechanisms or manners in which we behave, in which we think in certain ways to better protect or defend ourselves How can I protect myself in a better way? How can I defend myself in a better way? Especially when I am faced with a tensed situation, a stressful situation, an anxious situation, or frustrating situation, or frustrating experience. So we need some mechanisms, we need some manners to better protect ourselves, to better defend ourselves, better safeguard ourselves. So these are the mechanisms or manners which we employ unconsciously. Most of the time we employ them without our knowledge in order to better protect and defend ourselves. So whichever mechanisms are helping us to protect ourselves or to defend ourselves, they are the defense mechanisms. They are the mental mechanisms. And all of us have certain mental mechanisms or defense mechanisms. It is like a tortoise. When you are going to touch the tortoise, immediately it protects itself. The snail. When the snail perceives a danger or threat, immediately it shrinks. It goes inside. It protects itself into the shell. So likewise, we all have got some mental mechanisms or defense mechanisms to protect our mind. And ego readily, without our knowledge, employs them. And these defense mechanisms or the mental mechanisms are one way of looking at how people distance themselves from full awareness. It is way of looking, distancing ourselves. Distancing ourselves from unpleasant. Whatever is unpleasant, we distance ourselves. Unpleasant feelings, emotions, sentiments, ideas, etc. So distancing ourselves from unpleasant feelings, emotions, sentiments and ideas and behaviors. Behaviors and even thoughts. So basically these three: thoughts, emotions and behaviors. So it is our way of distancing ourselves from unpleasant feelings, emotions, sentiments, ideas, behaviors or thoughts. That is what we understand by mental mechanisms or defense mechanism. How do we distance ourselves from what is unpleasant? And the mechanisms and the strategies employed by our ego to protect ourselves, to protect our mind from all that is unpleasant. Everything that is unpleasant, we take a distance from. So I distance myself, or we distance ourselves from all that is unpleasant. And that mechanism is called defense mechanism. That mannerism is called defense mechanism. It is different ways of dealing with pain. Another simple words, different ways of dealing with pain. Different ways. Each person will have its own methodology or strategy or ways of dealing with pain. Different ways and means. Different ways and means. Different ways and means of dealing with the pain. Dealing with pain. That is a natural human tendency, is to protect oneself from pain. Enjoy the pleasure and avoid the pain. That is a natural tendency for all of us. So when we are experiencing pain and when we are faced with painful experience or unpleasant experience or unpleasant thoughts, emotions, sentiments, ideas, behaviors or thoughts, how do we cope up with that? So the different ways and means of dealing with pain. That is called as defense mechanisms or mental mechanisms. And these defense mechanisms can be healthy or unhealthy depending on the circumstances and how much a person uses them. They can be defense mechanisms. We can call them as DM. Defense mechanisms or mental mechanisms, MM. Defense mechanisms are mental mechanisms. They can be either healthy or unhealthy. Healthy or unhealthy. It all depends on how we use them. Unhealthy. So defense mechanism or mental mechanisms can be healthy or they can be also unhealthy. It all depends on the usage. Depends on the usage. How do I use these mechanisms? Depends on the usage. And it is a contribution of Sigmund Freud. So conceived by Sigmund Freud, much of the development of the defense mechanisms. It is originally they are contributed by Sigmund Freud. We have seen already in the last class. Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is the chief proponent of these defense mechanisms, and they are developed by Anna Freud, the daughter of Sigmund Freud, Anna Freud. And then there comes psychoanalytic psychologists, those who are the followers of Freud and Anna Freud. Psychoanalytic, those who deal with unconscious mind, following the theory of Sigmund Freud, who speaks about the three levels of mental life: conscious mind, pre-conscious mind, and subconscious mind. They are the ones known as psychoanalytic psychologists. So these defense mechanisms are proposed by Sigmund Freud, developed by Anna Freud, and then they are carried out and still further developed by psychoanalytic psychologists. Psychoanalytic school. Okay. Those who are the followers of Sigmund Freud and Anna Freud. And these defense mechanisms are categorized by psychologists, depends on how primitive they are. So basically the psychologists speak about three levels. Three levels of three categories we can speak of: primitive defenses, more primitive defenses, less primitive defenses, and mature defenses. So the defense mechanisms or mental mechanisms are categorized basically into three categories. Some even talk about four categories: psychotic defenses, immature defenses, neurotic defenses, and mature defenses. But simplifying that, we can say in three categories. So defense mechanisms are categorized by psychologists into three categories based on their development. Okay. So categories of mental mechanisms. Categories of mental mechanism or defense mechanism. DF, defense mechanism. So these categories based on their primitive, how primitive they are. That means some defenses start much early in our childhood. They are called primitive defenses. They are the defenses used by little kids. Okay, so we can call them as primitive defenses. More primitive defenses. More primitive defenses. And then there comes less primitive defenses, more primitive defenses, less primitive defenses, and finally mature differences. That's why we said differences can be healthy or unhealthy depends on how we use them. Okay, if you are using these defenses, more primitive defenses, childish defenses, or less primitive defenses, they can be unhealthy. Whereas there are some defenses which are very mature defenses. Mature defenses. The person who uses these mature defenses, they can be said to be healthy persons, because we all need to use some kind of defense mechanisms. But most of the time we employ either more primitive defenses or less primitive defenses. Thus, we tend to be immature people, or unhealthy way of handling our stress or handling our frustration and anxiety. From here, we are called to move towards employing mature defenses. We shall see what are these. So today let us look at them. The first category, the more primitive defenses. What are these primitive defenses? And all these defense mechanisms, they are by and large unconscious. All the defense mechanisms are mental mechanisms, are by and large unconscious. By and large unconscious. They are unconscious. That's why our ego immediately, without our knowledge, employs them, and we are not aware of them. By and large, they are unconscious, and we need, through the help of the psychotherapy, we can become aware of what defense mechanisms we are using. So how to know, since it is unconscious? Through the help of the psychotherapy or talk therapy, or through counseling, we will be made aware of what defenses are we using. Through counseling, it's mainly the psychotherapy, it is the main one. Since the defense mechanisms are mental mechanisms, are by and large unconscious, we are not aware of them, or we use them without our knowledge. We need to have some kind of psychotherapy through which we will be made to know, or we will be made aware of what kind of defenses are we using, what kind of defenses am I using to protect my mind from a stressful situation, or from anxious situation, from frustration and unpleasant thoughts, feelings and emotions. And talk therapy also can be helpful, and counseling, but mainly the psychotherapy is recommended to know more, to have more access towards these unconscious elements. Now we shall speak about the primitive defense mechanisms. More primitive defense mechanisms, or they are called as primitive defense mechanisms. There are basically seven more primitive defense mechanisms. Primitive defense, we can call them as primitive defense mechanism. Primitive means something that starts very early, even at our childhood. The very first moments of our childhood, or the first years of our childhood, we all develop some sorts of defense mechanisms. The problem is that we continue to use those strategies. When these strategies or mechanisms are used by the child, it is good for the child, or is acceptable. Whereas the same strategies or same mannerisms or same techniques are used by the adult, that means the adult is behaving like a child. That shows his immaturity of the person. We are called primitive defense mechanisms. The first category. They are the first category. First, primitive defense mechanisms. Primitive defense mechanisms. There are basically 7 primitive defense mechanisms. The first one is denial. Denial. The second one is regression. These are technical words, so we need to slowly learn to understand what it means. We shall explain. Denial, regression. Third one is acting out. Acting out. Fourth one is dissociation. 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 Fifth one is compartmentalization. Compartmentalization. Compartment. So compartmentalization. Compartmentalization. Compartment. So compartmentalization. The sixth one is projection. Projection. Seventh one is reaction formation. Reaction formation. Reaction formation. So these are the 7 defense mechanisms which are known as categorized as primitive defense mechanism because they develop very early in our life, in our childhood years. So they are called very primitive defense mechanisms. In other words, they are very immature defense mechanisms. So we shall look at each of them briefly. So we have denial, secondly regression, third one is acting out, fourth one is dissociation, fifth one is compartmentalization, sixth one is projection, and seventh one is reaction formation. Now we shall see each of them briefly. The first one is denial. What is denial? Denying everything that is unpleasant. That is called denial. More primitive defense. Primitive defense mechanisms. We are dealing with the first category now, that is primitive defense mechanisms. Primitive. The defenses which develop early in our life, in our childhood. Primitive defense mechanisms. The first one is denial. Denial. It's very clear from the name itself. Denying everything. Denying the reality. Denial is the refusal to accept the reality or fact. Refusal. Refusal. Refusal to accept. Refusal to accept the reality or the fact. I am not ready to accept the reality. I am not ready to accept the fact because it is not pleasant for me. It is something unpleasant. So, refusal to accept the reality or fact. Acting as if a painful event, thought, or feeling did not exist. Refusal to accept the painful reality. We can add that word, painful reality. Refusal to accept the painful reality or the fact. And acting as if they do not exist. The person is acting as if, means even though that is there, the person completely denies that because it is unpleasant. Acting as if it did not exist. Acting as if it did not exist. A painful reality. Because whenever I think about that painful reality, whenever I think about that painful fact or unpleasant fact, it is disturbing me. So I just deny that. And I live as though, as if this reality did not exist. It is very primitive because it develops in the early childhood, this particular defense mechanism. And many people use this denial in their everyday lives. Many people use this defense mechanisms to avoid painful happenings. Many people use this defense in everyday life. And they don't want to think about the unpleasant happening. They don't wish to admit, to avoid the painful feelings. Many people use this defense in their everyday life to avoid, mainly to avoid. That is their intention. They want to avoid painful feelings. Painful feelings, the same thing. Feelings, emotions and thoughts. The triad. Feelings, emotions and thoughts. Feelings, emotion, thoughts and behaviors. Feelings or emotions are same, thoughts and behaviors. That's why many people utilize this defense, because many people use this defense in everyday life to avoid painful feelings or emotions, thoughts and behavior. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to admit. For example, a person is addicted to alcohol, but he completely denies that. He says, I have no problem whatsoever. I am living a normal life. He just denies this fact because that is very unpleasant for him to hear, unpleasant for him to accept. So he just denies the fact that he is an alcoholic or he is addicted to alcohol, but he goes about drinking. But when it comes to argument or when people talk about it, he just denies that. Without his knowledge, he just denies that fact because it is very much unpleasant for him to hear that he is an alcoholic. So he completely avoids that, completely denies that. So that is the meaning of this denial. In many cases, whenever we don't want to accept particular fact which is painful or particular reality that is painful or something that is unpleasant, we just deny that. And a person acts as if it did not exist. That is the meaning of denial. I deny it so that I can live as if it does not exist. It did not exist. And many people use this particular defense called denial in everyday life to avoid painful feelings, emotions, thoughts and behaviors. Example I have said is alcoholic. 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 Denying. Alcoholic denying is drinking. Alcoholic denying drinking habits. And he goes about drinking habit. He just denies that fact because it is very unpleasant, very painful, very much frustrating for him. So that is the first one. Very simple. Whenever we employ this denial, that means we are going back to our child. We are becoming a little childish. It is very immature. Denial. Because denial will not solve the problem. It may give a temporary solution, but then it keeps aggravating the problem. So it is not the permanent solution to the problem. It is not a healthy defense mechanism to be used. Nevertheless, most of the people use this defense called denial. The second primitive defense mechanism is regression. Regression means going back, retreating to the past life. Regression. Second primitive defense mechanism. It's called regression. Here regression is reversion to an earlier stage of development. Reversion, going back, that is reversing. Reversion. Retreating means going back again, reverting back. Reversion to an earlier stage of development. Reversion to an earlier reversion to an earlier stage of development. When does the person reverse or goes back, retreats to an earlier stage of development? When faced with unacceptable, fearful, threatening thoughts or impulses. In the face of unacceptable, reversion to an earlier stage of development. When faced with unacceptable, painful, threatening. Whenever life is threatening or painful or unacceptable, the person goes back to his earlier stage of life, threatening. So, unacceptable, painful, threatening, fearful thoughts or impulses. Fearful also. Fearful thoughts or impulses. Thoughts or impulses. Kind of sensation. Whenever I have these unacceptable experiences or painful realities or threatening experience, fearful thoughts or impulses, then I go back, reverse to an earlier stage of development. For example, an adolescent who is overwhelmed with the fear of people, fear of strangers, he becomes more clingy, more attached, and start exhibiting earlier childhood behaviors which he has long ago overcome. For example, when we are kids, there is a habit of bedwetting. Bedwetting is a part of the growth of the child. Bedwetting, then slowly the parents train the child to come out of that habit. They are learned, or they are taught to go out to the washroom, to use the washroom properly and not in the bed. That is called bedwetting. That is a regression. So here the person goes back to that kind of experience where no one would question, because he is treated like a child, he is treated like a little kid, because he is finding it unacceptable or painful or threatening, fearful thoughts or impulses. So immediately he behaves like a small kid. The adult may regress when under a great deal of stress, refusing to leave the bed. This is kind of example. Even though he is an adult, he will be like lying on the bed, not willing to come out of the bed. Because that's what the child does. When child is angry, child is upset, it goes and lies on the bed, or it will be rolling on the ground. These are some of the strategies used by the child to get what it wants. Same thing when the adult, as he grows old, when faced with unacceptable situation, painful situation, threatening, fearful thoughts and impulses, he regresses back to the earlier stages of development. And you will be behaving like a kid. You will be exhibiting childish behavior. That is the meaning of regression. Adult turning to be a child. So adult may regress. So adult person regresses. Regress means going back when faced with distress. Distress means some kind of painful experience, no? So adult person regresses when faced with distress and behaves like a kid, behaves like a child, childish behavior. That is regression. Rolling on the ground or lying on the bed, and you will be unwilling to work, unwilling to go out and do work or study or to engage in some other activities. Instead of doing that one, this person is remaining on the bed. Regression. One example for regression is the adult person not able to come out of his room, not willing to work. So adult may regress when faced with a great deal of stress and refuses to leave the bed and engage in normal everyday activities. So adult person regresses, means goes back to his childhood days and when faced with distress or unpleasant, painful, threatening, fearful thoughts or impulses and situations, he regresses and exhibits childish behavior. That is regression. So whenever we are behaving like little kids, that means we are regressing to the old. That is a defense mechanism or mental mechanism used by us without our conscience, without our knowledge. That means the person is using primitive defense mechanism called regression, retreating back or reversing back to the earlier stage of development. When this strategy is used by the child, rolling on the ground or lying on the bed and bedwetting, all these acceptable, because it is part of the development of the child. But when the same strategies are used by the adult, that means that adult is showing an immature behavior by reversing back to the earlier stage of development, becoming like a child. Adult becoming a child, regressing when faced with the distress. That is regression. Or crying like a child. These are all regressing. The third one is acting out. Third primitive mechanisms. Acting out. So we have seen two. One is denying the reality completely because it is unpleasant. Second one is regressing back or reversing back to the earlier stage of development because it is not pleasant for me, because I am in a situation of danger, so I behave like a child. So that is another unhealthy or immature defense mechanism used by the persons. So first one is denial, denying the reality. Here regressing means reversing back to the earlier stage of development and behaving like a small child, childish behaviors. That is the second defense mechanism. The third one is acting out, another primitive defense mechanism. Acting out. The third one is acting out. Acting out. What is this acting out? Acting out is performing an extreme behavior in order to express thoughts or feelings the person feels incapable of expressing. So performing an extreme behavior, that is acting out. Performing. Whatever I am not able to express, I perform with my actions. That is acting out, performing. Performing an extreme behavior. Extreme, not a normal behavior, it is extreme behavior. Performing an extreme behavior. Performing an extreme behavior in order to express thoughts or feelings that I am not capable of expressing. So I am not able to express my thoughts, I am not able to express my feelings, so I am performing an extreme behavior. Because I am not able to express my thoughts, I am not able to express my feelings, but it comes in the form of behavior, extreme behavior. So that is the acting out, performing an extreme behavior because not able to express feelings and thoughts. Not able to express feelings and thoughts. So behavior is coming. I am not able to express my feelings, I am not able to express my thoughts, so I am expressing it by acting out, by performing an extreme behavior. By doing that, I am expressing my thoughts, I am expressing my feelings. A simple example, I am angry with you. I am angry with my mother or angry with my parents or somebody. I don't express that feeling. I don't express that share. Immediately I take a book and throw at them. I take a book and throw outside. Or I take any of the object that I get in my hand, or I break the television, or I break the glass. That is an extreme behavior. What is the reason? I am angry with my parents. I am angry with my siblings. I am angry with my family members. That is the reason. And that is my feeling. I am not able to express, but through this extreme behavior of breaking the television, or throwing the book, or throwing the things that are around, I am acting out. That is example. So acting out is a performing an extreme behavior. Because the person is not able to express his feelings, the person is not able to express thoughts. Example is breaking something. Breaking something when angry with someone. Breaking something when angry with someone. When angry with someone. That is an example to understand this acting out. So I am extremely angry with my parents. I am extremely angry with my siblings or my relatives or loved ones. So I am not able to express. So I take the object and throw it outside, or I break the television, or I break the other things at home when angry with someone. That is acting out. By doing that, I get some relief. So this acting out behavior will serve as a pressure release. After doing that, the person will calm down a little. It serves as a pressure release. In fact, all the mechanisms, they will help for a while for the person to feel better. So it serves as a pressure release. Pressure release. My pressure is released now. I feel free. Pressure release. And it keeps the person calmer for a while. It keeps the individual. It keeps the person. It keeps the person calm. Keeps the person calm for a while. Person calm for a while. Afterwards again the behavior will start again. For a while. For a short while I will be calm. So that is the meaning of this. Acting out serves as a pressure release. My pressure is released after throwing the book, after throwing my pen, after breaking the television. I calm down. Because my anger is expressed. I am not able to express my feeling, I am not able to express my thoughts, but I have engaged myself in the angry behavior, extreme behavior. By doing that, I feel a little calm, because that serves as a pressure release. Another one is self-injury. Another example also can be self-injury. I am angry with myself, or angry with somebody at home, angry with my friend, but I am not able to express, so I cut myself. Cutting one's hand, that is an extreme behavior through which a feeling is expressed, anger is expressed. Self-injury. Cutting one's hand, cutting one's hand, harming oneself. Are childish behaviors. That's why they are called primitive defense mechanisms. Harming oneself. But they are also utilized by many of the adults because they have not properly developed themselves. So that is acting out, the third primitive defense mechanism. So performing an extreme behavior when the person is not able to express his feelings or thoughts. Example is breaking something when angry with someone at home, and this acting out serves as a pressure release. Pressure is released for a while, it keeps the person calm for a while, afterwards again it starts through some other ways. Another example is self-injury, cutting one's hand or harming oneself. So these will serve as a immediate relief for the person because the person is not expressing himself properly. So that is the third primitive defense mechanism called acting out. The fourth one is dissociation. Fourth defense mechanism. So dissociation. Primitive defense mechanism. Dissociation. Dissociation. What is dissociation? Dissociation. Dissociation means trying to disconnect from the real world. That is the meaning. Disconnecting. Trying to disconnect. Disconnect. Trying to disconnect from the real world. Trying to disconnect from the real world. When do I get disconnected? When I am faced with unpleasant happenings, unpleasant feelings, unpleasant thoughts, unpleasant experience or frustrating experience. It is unable to manage. I am unable to manage myself, so I disconnect from the real world. So trying to disconnect from the real world to protect the self from unbearable thoughts, feelings and memories. Trying to disconnect from the real world to protect, to defend, to protect the self from unpleasant or unbearable. Unpleasant or unbearable. Protect the self from unpleasant or unbearable thoughts, feelings and impulses. Unpleasant thoughts, feelings, memories. Whatever is unpleasant, I am not able to handle them. I am not at home with it. I am not able to deal with them. So I disconnect from the real world. I forget that I am in this world. The person thinks he or she is out of this world. That is dissociation. As opposed to the association. Association means when I associate, when I feel connected with something, when I feel connected to someone. Whereas dissociation means the person feels disconnected from this world. The person feels disconnected from the real world, and he or she will go to the imaginary world, a world which does not exist, because this world is so painful. This world is not pleasant. This world is troublesome. This world is unbearable. The thoughts are unbearable. Feelings are unbearable. The memories are not so pleasant. So to avoid that one, the person feels disconnected from this real world. That is dissociation. Trying to disconnect from the real world to protect the self. By doing that, the person feels relieved. One example is amnesia, is forgetfulness. The person simply forgets things. Why? Because by remembering, it is very painful. Amnesia, forgetfulness. It has to do with the memories. Amnesia, forgetfulness. It's a sickness. Amnesia. I don't try to remember things. I try to forget things because they are not pleasant. If I remember them, they hurt me. They disturb me. I feel frustrated, so I don't want to think about them. So I feel disconnected from the reality. Forgetfulness. That is amnesia. So this is one of the defense used by some people to cope up with the realities. Dissociation. Okay. So we have seen 4 defense mechanisms. In the first category, primitive defense mechanism. That is denial, totally denying the reality. That is because it is unpleasant for me. The second one is regression, reversing back to the earlier stage because things are not pleasant for me to handle. The third one is acting out, engaging myself or engaging in self in an extreme behavior because the person is not able to express the feelings, sentiments and thoughts. The fourth one is dissociation. The person feels disconnected from the real world to protect the self from unpleasant or unbearable thoughts, feelings and memories. One example is amnesia, it's forgetfulness. I want to forget the happenings. I want to forget my thoughts, my memories, my feelings because I am not comfortable with it. That is called dissociation. I feel totally disconnected from this world. It is also one of the primitive defense mechanisms. These mechanisms have develop in our childhood. So that's why they are called as primitive defense mechanisms. They are very much immature defense mechanisms. So the rest of the mechanisms we shall see in the next class. Thank you.